Okay, so welcome to this video. In this video what we're going to discuss is Alzheimer's disease, okay, and we're also going to discuss medications used to treat Alzheimer's disease, all two of them. Okay, right, so the title then for this video is Alzheimer's disease and also Alzheimer's disease medications, and Alzheimer's disease medications. Okay, so let me now outline the structure then for this video. Okay, so we're going to start off with a broad overview of what actually happens to you in Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so we're going to start off with the symptoms of early Alzheimer's disease, and then we'll see how the disease progresses and how the symptoms progress. Okay, then what we'll do is have a view, a quite far back view, where we'll look at which portions of the brain are actually going to degenerate, okay, at each stage, and how this is going to contribute to the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease, fundamentally, it is a neurodegenerative process. Okay, then what we'll do is we'll zoom in and we'll look at what is known about the biochemical process which is actually occurring, which is causing the neurodegeneration. Okay, and then finally what we'll move on to is we'll discuss the medications that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease, and one of these medications is going to give us some sort of insight into the neurodegenerative process itself potentially. Okay, and we'll see that right at the end. Okay, so the first thing then that I want to say before we actually discuss a broad overview of how the disease progresses and what the symptoms are at each stage, okay, the first thing I want to say is who this disease is actually named after. Okay, so the disease itself is named after Alzheimer, okay, who in 1901 first described the disease. Okay, so he described the symptoms of it. Whoops, what am I doing? Alzheimer. So he described the symptoms of the disease, and he also did more than just that. He also examined the brains of people who were suffering from this disease, and he actually began to understand some of the histological features of the brains of people suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and he was the first to characterize these histological features, which we're going to see later on, which are the amyloid plaques and the neurofibrillary tangles. Okay, right, so that's who this entire disease is named after, Alzheimer. Okay, so let's now move on to a discussion of the actual disease itself. So we're going to discuss the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, starting with very early Alzheimer's disease. Okay, right, so when you are in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, the main symptom that you have is that you have deficits in declarative memory. So deficits in declarative memory is the first symptom to emerge in Alzheimer's disease, and we'll see why this is. Okay, deficits in declarative memory. Now, what does declarative memory actually mean? So this word declarative means memories that are actually consciously recountable. Okay, so declarative, you could almost replace that with conscious memories, basically. Memories that you can consciously recall, okay, are grouped under this term declarative memories. Okay, consciously recall then. Okay, so you have problems with declarative memory then. You start to forget things, you start to maybe lose some of your older memories, maybe forget some of the things that have occurred in your life, so your declarative memory starts to suffer. That's the first symptom of early Alzheimer's disease. Okay, right. Now, in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease, so we'll now have later stages of Alzheimer's disease, it starts to get worse. Okay, you start to get full-blown dementia. Okay, so what is meant by dementia? Well, dementia encompasses three things mainly. Firstly, you lose memory. Okay, so dementia includes loss of declarative memory. So memory goes down, that's part of dementia. Okay, but other things as well are included under the term dementia. Okay, you also lose cognitive ability, so cognition goes down. So what sort of things are counted as cognition then? Okay, so problem solving is one of the things that you would count as cognition. Okay, so coming up with solutions to problems. Okay, so problem solving ability goes down. In addition, language is counted as part of cognition. So your ability to understand what other people are saying to you, and also your ability to talk. Okay, to make speech that other people can then interpret. Okay, so both aspects of language are also going to suffer, both the production of language and also the interpretation of language. Okay, so language is going to go down. Okay, calculation is another good example of cognition. That's certainly going to go down. Okay, and another aspect of cognition that I'll tell you about is also the visuospatial perception. Okay, so what is meant by visuospatial perception? Okay, so basically visuospatial perception means being able to visualize in 3 dimensions. Okay, being able to understand how space fits together in 3 dimensions. So visuospatial perception. Okay, so all of these 4 things that I've written here, problem solving, language, calculation, and visuospatial perception, they are all counted as part of cognition, and all of these things are going to suffer in the later stages of Alzheimer's disease. In addition, the other dramatic thing that comes under this umbrella term of dementia is also that you get personality changes as well. So dementia means these 3 things mainly. These are the principal 3 things that occur in dementia. That you lose declarative memory, cognition is reduced, which means all of these 4 things are reduced, and also you start to get personality changes. Okay, right. So all of these things are going to occur in later stages of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, right. And now we'll do the latest stages of Alzheimer's disease. So the really late stages of Alzheimer's disease. So what should I call these? Really late, I'll call it. So the really late stages of Alzheimer's disease, you become mute. Okay, so you can no longer talk. Okay, generally you also become incontinent. Okay, so that means that you no longer have voluntary control over when you urinate and when you defecate. Okay, and also generally you become bedridden. So it doesn't end nicely, Alzheimer's disease. It does eventually kill you. Okay, and then obviously the final stage is death. Okay, right. So Alzheimer's disease then, that's the broad overview of how the disease progresses. Okay, what we now want to talk about is what abnormalities are actually occurring on the level of the brain. Well, fundamentally, Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, which means that neurons inside the brain are going to die in this disease. Okay, right. So the features then that can be observed on the level of the brain are, firstly, if you compare an Alzheimer's disease patient's brain to someone of the same age who does not have Alzheimer's disease, what you will find is that the weight of their brain is less. Okay, so that's one of the features of the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease, that the weight of the brain has decreased. Okay, now there's a special word for this, atrophy. Okay, so atrophy is just a fancy word that means wasting away, basically. So we describe what is happening in Alzheimer's disease as brain atrophy. The brain starts to waste away, and this results in the weight of the brain going down markedly. Okay, another feature by which you could identify the brain of an Alzheimer's disease patient, if you had this scenario where you had a brain of a normal patient and a brain of someone who is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, usually it is very obvious which brain is from the person with Alzheimer's disease. Okay, but I'm going to spell out the obvious differences. So firstly, the weight has gone down. Secondly, Okay, if you were looking just from the side, so let's say you couldn't pick it up and you couldn't actually feel the weight, if you were looking from the side, there's a way of telling. Okay, right, so let me just outline what the brain looks like if you look from the side. So let's draw the left cerebral hemisphere from the side here. Okay, so here is the left cerebral hemisphere and we're looking from the side. Now, the surface of the cerebral hemispheres is not just smooth. Okay, instead all over it you have these invaginations. Okay, so for instance there's one here, there's an invagination of the cerebral cortex here known as the lateral fissure. Okay, so this invagination where the cerebral cortex is basically bent back on itself. Okay, this is the lateral fissure, but it's not the only one. There are loads of them. In fact, the brain is covered in them. There's one here. Okay, there's loads of them all over the place, basically. There's loads of these things. Okay, now, where they are less big than, for instance, the lateral fissure, instead of being known as fissures, instead they are called sulci. Okay, or the singular is a sulcus. Okay. Right, so a sulcus, or the plural, I'll put the plural as well, is the sulci. Okay, these are invaginations of the cerebral cortex. They're where effectively the cerebral cortex is bent inwards. Okay, right, and the cerebral cortex will be lining both sides of the sulcus. Okay, so effectively it's just a little sort of crack in the cerebral cortex where you've effectively pushed the cerebral cortex down and now you've got this crack that's visible on the surface, but in fact if you were a little man and you went into the crack, all the walls of that crack would be lined by cerebral cortex. Okay, right. So why are we discussing this? Well, in people with Alzheimer's disease, these sulci are hugely enlarged. So the sulci become much, much bigger, much more pronounced, basically, in Alzheimer's disease. Now, corresponding to this, the portions in between the sulci, they become smaller. Now, there's a special word for the portions in between the sulci. So in between these two sulci here, we've got a place where the cerebral cortex is just smooth, and this is known as a gyrus. Okay, or the plural is gyri. Okay, so in Alzheimer's disease, the sulci get more pronounced and the gyri get less pronounced. They get smaller. Okay, so that's another feature by which you can identify the brain of someone who was suffering with Alzheimer's disease. Okay, right. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is the fact that the cerebral ventricles are hugely enlarged in someone suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Okay, now for this I want to describe a bit of neuroanatomy, because I'm not assuming that everyone watching this video will be familiar with what the cerebral ventricles are. So I'm going to give a little bit of neuroanatomy which will help us to understand what the cerebral ventricles are. Okay, right. So I will build this up. I will start with a picture that I'm assuming that everyone will be familiar with, and then we'll work up and see what the cerebral ventricles are, and then we'll discuss how they're going to be enlarged in people suffering from Alzheimer's disease. Okay, right. So the picture that I'm going to start off with, which I'm going to assume that everyone is familiar with, is just the picture that you see when you look at the brain from the left-hand side. So we've just discussed this picture where we're looking at the left cerebral hemisphere from the left-hand side. Okay, but now I'm going to add a few other parts on to this picture. Okay, so poking out from underneath the left cerebral hemisphere, what you're going to have is the lower portions of the brainstem here. Okay, so the pons is this section here, or we're seeing the lower section of it, and then underneath the pons you've got the medulla, and then you go into the spinal cord below. Okay, and then also behind the brainstem you're going to then have the cerebellum. Okay, so let's label up this picture here. Okay, so this is just what you see if you're looking at a brain from the left-hand side. So this is the cerebellum here, which literally means little brain. Okay, now the cerebellum is incredibly involved in the motor system. It's involved in the calibration of fine movements. So when you catch a ball and well, when you catch a ball, it needs to be an extremely fine-tuned movement, okay? If it's a tiny bit off, you're not going to catch the ball, okay? The cerebellum is involved in making sure that the movements are extremely calibrated to the visual stimuli that you're getting about the ball. Okay, right. And then we've got the brainstem here, and we're not going to see that much about the cerebellum. I'm just mentioning it here as part of the neuroanatomy. In fact, that's all we're going to see of the cerebellum. Okay, right. Underneath, here we have the spinal cord, and of course we can only see the top of the spinal cord, but it will in fact go all the way down the vertebral column. Okay, now I'll mark on here the foramen magnum. This is the point where you actually enter the base of the skull. Okay, so this is the head through which the spinal cord, this is the hole through which the spinal cord is going to pass to get into the skull. And that hole has a special name. It's known as foramen, which means hole, and then magnum, which means big. Okay, right, so there are loads of foramina in the skull, and the foramen magnum is easily the biggest. Okay, right. Then, above the spinal cord, the first portion of the brainstem then that we have down here is the medulla. Now this really is just the continuation of the spinal cord, is the way I would urge you to think of it. And it's going up right in the midline, so you only have one brainstem, okay? And it's sitting right in between the two cerebral hemispheres underneath them, okay? So this first section of the brainstem, this is the medulla. Okay, then above the medulla, the section here is the bottom of the pons. Okay, so I'll colour in the pons in blue here. Okay, right, and then the only other thing that we can see on this picture is then the cerebral hemisphere here, the left cerebral hemisphere, which I'll colour in yellow here. Okay, so this is the cerebrum, okay, which is another word for cerebral hemisphere. Okay, now we might just talk about the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so the cerebral hemisphere, both cerebral hemispheres, both the left and the right one, are divided into lobes, and they're both divided into lobes in exactly the same way. Okay, so this portion in front of this dashed line that I've drawn here, this is the frontal lobe. Oops, and I missed out the R. I was just about to put it in, I think. Frontal lobe here. Okay, then behind the frontal lobe, between these two lines that I've put here, this is the parietal lobe. Okay, and then, whoops, I'm missing out letters all the time now. Parietal lobe, and then this section here, right at the back, this is known as the occipital lobe. Okay, and then finally, this one along the side here is the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is then the temporal lobe, and their positions correspond to which portion of the skull they are closest to. Okay, so this is the temporal lobe. Sorry, their names correspond to which portion of the skull they are closest to. Okay, right. So that's the first picture then that we're going to draw of the brain. Okay, so we haven't seen a single ventricle yet, but we're now going to take this picture and go further on so that we can begin to start to see the ventricles. Okay, now the first ventricle that I am going to tell you about is the third ventricle. I think it's the most natural one to start with, and then we will see the first and second ventricles, and then the fourth ventricle. In fact, I think I'm going to do the third ventricle, then the fourth ventricle, and then we'll do the first and the second ventricles. Okay, right, so we're going for the third ventricle then. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue on the brainstem upwards. Okay, so we're going to strip away the cerebral hemispheres, okay, and we're going to look at the continuation of the brainstem upwards, and then we're going to see what structures are going to sit on top of the brainstem. Okay, right, so let me draw out this picture again. So here is the spinal cord here. Okay, then above the spinal cord we know that we've got the medulla. Okay, then we've got the pons above that, and now I'm drawing the complete pons because before we could only see the bottom half of the pons, okay, because the cerebral hemisphere was on top of it. So here's the pons in blue. Okay, here in red is the medulla, and I'll just move this up a little bit. Okay, and then underneath the medulla In green we then have the spinal cord. Okay, right, so then above the pons, the next section of the brainstem, and in fact the final section of the brainstem, is the midbrain, okay, which I'll colour in orange here. Okay, so those three structures, the medulla, the pons, and then this midbrain that we've got here, okay, those together are known as the brainstem. Okay, so all these three sections here are known as the brainstem. Okay, now we're going to have a look at the structures above the brainstem. Okay, so above the brainstem, sitting on top of the midbrain, we're going to have the thalami. Okay, now you do not just have one thalamus. All of the brainstem structures, you only had one of them. You had one medulla, one pons, one midbrain. Now you're going to have bilateral thalami. Okay, so we're looking from the left-hand side, so we're going to see the left thalamus sitting on top of the left side of the midbrain. Okay, so let me colour this structure in turquoise here. Okay, so that there, this is the left thalamus, okay, and it will be sitting on top of the left side of the midbrain. You will also have a right thalamus sitting on the right side of the midbrain. Okay, we will come back and look at a different, well, we'll look at this from a different angle. We'll look at it from above in a moment, and that will make this all much clearer. Okay, right. Now, the next structure that I want to put on here is the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus sits in front of the thalamus and also in front of the midbrain. Okay, here it is. So, it's also got other important structures associated with it. Okay, so let me explain what some of these little processes are here. So firstly, this structure here, this is not part of the hypothalamus. This is in fact the optic chiasm. Okay, this is where fibers from the two optic nerves, okay, are going to cross over. So in fact, this structure is right on the base of the brain. If we were to turn this brain here upside down, okay, and look at the bottom, we would see the bottom of the hypothalamus, we would see the optic chiasm, we would see this structure here, which is the pituitary gland dangling down here, and we would also see these structures here, of which on this picture we can only see one, okay, but there's actually two of them, one on each side. We're seeing the left one here, and these are known as the mammillary bodies. Okay, right, but the point of that was that this is the bottom of the brain, okay? Right, so here is the optic chiasm, coloured in yellow there. Okay, then also dangling down from the hypothalamus here, we've got the pituitary gland, both portions of the pituitary gland. Okay, we've got the anterior pituitary here and the posterior pituitary here. So this is the pituitary gland. Okay, and then behind the pituitary gland over here, we've got the mammillary bodies. Okay, and as I said previously, there are actually two of these. We're only seeing the left mammillary body here. Okay, so I'll actually just label it up left mammillary body, but there would be one on the right hand side as well. Okay, right. Now the mammillary bodies are actually extremely important for such tiny little innocuous structures. They are actually incredibly important in memory, in fact. Okay, but we won't actually go into the involvement of the mammillary bodies in memory. Okay, we will have to discuss memory because it's one of the key things that's affected in Alzheimer's disease, but we won't be discussing the theory of memory to the depth that we will be going into what the mammillary bodies do. Okay, right. So I'm now highlighting all of the hypothalamus in pink. So the mammillary bodies are part of the hypothalamus. Okay, so all of this is the hypothalamus here. Okay, and then, oops, I'll just tidy this up a little bit. Then below the pituitary stalk, as it's called, which is here, you've then got the anterior and the posterior pituitary there in green. Okay, right, so I should have just labelled up this actually as the hypothalamus. So this is all the hypothalamus. Okay, so that's all well and good, but we haven't actually seen a single ventricle yet. Okay, in the next picture we will see a ventricle. It's difficult to explain the ventricles without going into this background neuroanatomy. Okay, so what we're now going to do is we're going to view this structure from above now. Okay, we're going to view the thalamus and the hypothalamus from above, and this is actually going to be very illuminating, seeing these structures from above rather than just seeing them from the side here. Okay, so we will start off then with looking at what the midbrain looks like if you look at it from above. Okay, now the midbrain actually has a much more interesting structure when you look at it from above than when you look at it from the side. When you looked at it from the side, it was really boring. Okay, but from above, it's fantastically interesting. It actually looks incredibly like Mickey Mouse. Okay, so I'll draw it here, and I've just realised, well, I haven't left enough space in front of it now, but I'm going to have to draw it as two separate pictures now that I've done this. Okay, never mind. I'll show you the structure of the midbrain, and then we'll move on to looking at this picture where we look at the thalamus and the hypothalamus from above. So I lied, we're not going to actually see the third ventricle in this picture. That will be the next picture. Okay, so this is what the midbrain looks like, and it does indeed look a little bit like Mickey Mouse. So here are the ears of Mickey Mouse. Okay, in actual fact, in the case of the midbrain, they're called the cerebral peduncles. Okay, now I'll outline a few more features of the midbrain. One, because they're going to be useful to us, well, one of them is anyway, okay, but also to try and make you appreciate that it does look like Mickey Mouse. Okay, so one of the key structures then of the midbrain is that you have this region known as the periaqueductal grey, okay, and in the middle of the periaqueductal grey you have a tube. Okay, and this tube is actually going to be really important for us since we're talking about the ventricles. This is known as the cerebral aqueduct. Okay, now this is a tube that goes all the way through the midbrain. Okay, like so. And it's going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and it's actually going to connect the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, but we will come back to this later on. Okay, so this is going to be extremely important. The third ventricle is going to be up here basically, and the cerebral aqueduct is going to be draining it. The fourth ventricle is going to be down here, and the cerebral aqueduct is going to be draining into the fourth ventricle. Okay, right. Now, this portion of the midbrain tissue which surrounds the cerebral aqueduct then, that is known as the periaqueductal grey. Okay, or the periaqueductal grey matter if you're going to be full about it. Okay, and for short, the periaqueductal grey is often abbreviated to the PAG. P for peri, A for aqueductal, and then G for grey. Okay, so what colour should I colour the periaqueductal grey in? I don't actually have a grey pen, okay, so I'll colour it in blue there. Okay, and then you've got the cerebral aqueduct running down the middle. Okay, two other important structures. These projections that we are seeing from the back here, okay, these have a name. These are known as the superior colliculi. Okay, now I'm assuming we are looking at the top of the midbrain. We are looking at a section like this, basically, right at the top of the midbrain, and that's why we're seeing the superior colliculi. Now, the midbrain actually also has inferior colliculi, so if I put them on this picture, you've got projections coming out from the back of the midbrain. The top ones, and we're only seeing the left one here, but in fact there'd be a right one which would be behind the left one on this picture. Those are the superior colliculi. So here we can see both superior colliculi. We can see the left superior colliculus, which is the only one we can see here, and then the right superior colliculus, which will be hidden behind the left superior colliculus on this picture. Okay, colliculi, yes, that's fine, colliculi, yeah, that is about right. Okay, and then on this picture we can see something that we can't see on this picture. We can see that there are also two inferior colliculi. Well, we can't see that there are two, but we can see at least that there is one. In reality there is two. There's a left inferior colliculus and a right inferior colliculus. Okay, right, so I will cover the superior colliculi in green here. Okay, right, so those are two other features of the midbrain. Okay, right, then just to complete the Mickey Mouse picture, I will also show you the structures that look like the eyes of Mickey Mouse, okay? And whenever I draw midbrains, they end up looking more like pigs than Mickey Mouse. But when you see them on an MRI scan, they really do look like Mickey Mouse. Okay, so these two structures that I'm showing here, these are the red nuclei, and you've got two of them. You've got the left red nucleus and the right red nucleus. Okay, so these are the red nuclei. Okay, so that's enough features of the midbrain as far as we're concerned. Okay, what we now want to do is draw another picture of this where we're going to put the thalami sitting on top of the midbrain. And I think we'll do this here, where we've got enough space to then draw the hypothalamus sitting in front of the thalamus. Okay, right. So here then, this is the midbrain. These are the two cerebral peduncles on each side. Then we've got the superior colliculi here. Okay, and then the connecting up like that. And this one's less symmetric than this one. This one was a very good picture, in fact. That's probably one of my best ones that I've ever drawn. Okay, that was very nicely symmetric. This one I failed to get it nicely symmetric. Okay, right. So, now I'm going to explain in more detail the fact that you have two thalami. So, sitting on top of the left side of the midbrain here, we're going to have the left thalamus sitting. Okay, and the thalami are both egg-shaped structures. Okay, so here's the left thalamus, and then sitting on top of the right side of the midbrain here, you're going to have another one of these egg-shaped structures, which is the right thalamus. Okay, so let's colour them in turquoise here. Okay, so in that picture that we drew before, we were only seeing the left thalamus because we were looking from the left-hand side, so the right thalamus was hidden behind the left thalamus. Okay, so there are the two thalami. Now, you will notice that there is this space between the two thalami. Okay, this is going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid, and this cerebrospinal fluid in this space is going to be in continuum with the cerebral aqueduct here. So this is the cerebral aqueduct, and this space between the two thalami, this is part of the third ventricle. The third ventricle is actually bigger than just the space in between the two thalami, however. It goes forward quite a bit as well. Okay, so let's show that now. So basically, we're now going to add on the hypothalamus. So we're going forward in this picture here now. Okay, now on the picture that I've shown you here, it just looks like the hypothalamus is one continuous solid lump. In reality, the hypothalamus is not one continuous solid lump. In reality, it's hollow. It's got a great big chamber inside it. Okay, so let me show it. It, in fact, is only the walls, okay, of this chamber. So this is what the hypothalamus looks like if we look at it from above. Okay, it makes up the wall here, and that's the wall that we're seeing from this left-hand side. We are seeing this, basically. If we were looking from the right-hand side, we'd see this wall here, and it would just look like the mirror image of this picture here. Okay, right. So, let me colour this in then in pink. Okay, so the hypothalamus then makes up the lateral walls, and of course also the anterior wall, of the third ventricle. In addition, it also makes up the floor of the third ventricle, because remember, if you look at the brain from the underside, you're going to see the hypothalamus, okay? The hypothalamus has a base. It makes up the base of this third ventricle here, and then you'll have the mammillary bodies dangling down from this floor here, and you'll also have the pituitary gland dangling down from around here. The mammillary bodies will be dangling down from around here, then you'll have the pituitary gland dangling down from around here, and then you'll have the optic chiasm sort of dangling down from around here. Okay, right. And then all of this space here is going to be full of cerebrospinal fluid, and it's in continuum with this gap between the two thalami here, which is also full of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, then right at the back, the boundary is made up by a very important gland, okay, which I'll put in blue, or have it in, okay, and this gland is known as the pineal gland, okay, which secretes melatonin. Okay, so this is the pineal gland. Okay, so those are all of the lateral boundaries then of the third ventricle. It is also, of course, bounded above, okay, but we won't go into that. Right, so This then is the third ventricle. That's the first one of the cerebral ventricles. Okay, we're now going to use the third ventricle to develop the fourth and the first and the second ventricles as well. Okay, so I think we'll call it there for this video, and in the next video what we'll do is we'll continue our discussion of the anatomy of the ventricles, and we'll look at the fourth ventricle and then the first and the second ventricles.